The Old West is usually remembered through images of dusty gunfighters, ruthless outlaws, stagecoach robbers, and lawmen chasing criminals across endless frontier towns. But there was another side to the story: women who rode horses, carried weapons, stole cattle, helped fugitives, robbed stagecoaches, ran gambling houses, and sometimes stood their ground against men who thought they were untouchable. Some became criminals, others simply lived outside the strict rules expected of women at the time, and a few became so legendary that separating the real woman from the myth is almost impossible. Today we're counting down 20 of the most dangerous, notorious, and unforgettable women of the Old West. And stay until the end, because some of these women were far more intimidating than their glamorous photographs suggest. If you enjoy forgotten history, make sure you subscribe, because there are plenty more incredible Old West stories coming. At number 20, Mattie Silks. Mattie Silks wasn't a traditional outlaw, but she became one of the most powerful women in the rough world of the American frontier. Known as the Queen of Denver's red light district, Silks built a successful business empire around brothels and became famous for her independence and toughness. She was also associated with a notorious feud involving rival Madam Kate Fulton. Newspapers sensationalized their conflict, turning an ordinary brawl and shooting into the legendary nude duel. Silks was known to carry a pistol, and in a world where violence could erupt without warning, she understood that reputation was often as valuable as a weapon. At number 19, Lottie Deno. Lottie Deno became famous not because she robbed banks, but because she could dominate a gambling table in a world controlled largely by men. A celebrated gambler in Texas and New Mexico, she developed a reputation for extraordinary poker skills and courage. Her life became surrounded by colorful stories, including tales of gunfights and high-stakes gambling. Her nickname reportedly came from dinero, Spanish for money. Lottie eventually left the gambling world behind, but during her frontier years, she was a woman men learned not to underestimate. At number 18, Josie Bassett. Josie Bassett grew up in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. Her family's ranch became associated with notorious outlaws, including members of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Josie learned to ride and handle firearms from a young age, and she later became associated with several famous outlaws. She was also accused of cattle rustling and bootlegging. The National Park Service describes her life as one that embodied the reality of the Wild West rather than the romantic version seen in movies. Yet Josie survived the outlaw era and eventually lived into her 90s, becoming one of the last living links to that world. At number 17, Queen Anne Bassett. Josie's sister, Anne Bassett, was known as Queen Anne, or the Cattle Queen. She was an accomplished horsewoman who grew up around cattlemen and outlaws. Anne became romantically associated with Butch Cassidy and other members of the Wild Bunch, and rumors followed her for years. She was accused of cattle rustling and was believed to have used her connections with outlaws to protect her family's ranch from powerful cattle interests. Whether every story about her was true is another question, but her reputation alone was enough to make people think twice before crossing the Bassett family. At number 16, Cattle Annie. Anna Emmeline. McDooley, better known as Cattle Annie, was still a teenager when she entered the dangerous world of Oklahoma Territory outlaws. She became associated with Jenny Little Britches Stevenson, and the two young women rode through the territory stealing horses, selling alcohol illegally, and warning outlaw groups when law officers were nearby. They reportedly dressed in men's clothing and carried pistols. Cattle Annie was eventually captured and sentenced to a reformatory. What's remarkable is that her criminal career was relatively brief, yet it became legendary enough to inspire books and films decades later. At number 15, Little Britches. Jenny Stevenson, known as Little Britches, was Cattle Annie's equally notorious companion. She was an accomplished rider and was known for her willingness to challenge law enforcement. During one attempted capture, she reportedly escaped custody and later fired a rifle while being pursued by officers. Eventually, Marshal Bill Tillman captured her after shooting her horse. She was sentenced for horse theft and selling liquor illegally. Her story became so famous that Hollywood eventually transformed the two young women into larger-than-life Western characters. At number 14, Big Nose. Kate. Mary Catherine Horoni. Cummings, better known as Big Nose Kate, is remembered primarily for her relationship with legendary gunfighter Doc Holliday, but calling her simply Doc Holliday's girlfriend misses much of what made her fascinating. Kate lived a turbulent frontier life filled with saloons, gambling, arguments, and dangerous people. She was reportedly fiercely independent and unwilling to behave like the respectable Victorian women's society expected her to be. Stories surrounding her life have been embellished, but her association with one of the West's most feared gunfighters ensured that her name survived alongside his. At number 13, Lillian Smith. Lillian Smith was one of the West's remarkable female sharpshooters. Unlike many women on this list, she didn't become famous primarily through outlaw activity. Instead, she made her reputation through extraordinary skill with firearms. She performed shooting exhibitions and became a competitor to other famous female marksmen. In a frontier culture that celebrated gunfighters and expert shooters, Smith demonstrated that a woman could handle a weapon with remarkable precision. Her story is a reminder that dangerous didn't always mean criminal. It could also mean possessing a skill that few people expected a woman to have. At number 12, Calamity Jane. Martha, Jane Canary, better known as Calamity Jane, remains one of the most recognizable women of the Old West. She worked as a scout, traveled through frontier settlements, rode horses, drank heavily, and became famous for her association with legendary figures of the American frontier. She often wore clothing considered masculine for her time and embraced a lifestyle far removed from conventional expectations for women. But Calamity Jane's reputation also grew through her own storytelling and later dime novels. That means some of her most dramatic adventures are difficult to verify. Still, few women became as closely identified with the wild frontier as Calamity Jane. At number 11, Pearl Hart. Pearl Hart may be the closest thing the Old West had to a female stagecoach bandit. In 1899, Hart and her partner Joe Boot robbed an Arizona stagecoach. Hart disguised herself in men's clothing and participated directly in the robbery. The pair escaped initially but were soon captured. Hart's trial became a sensation because society was fascinated by the idea of a woman being charged with such a crime. She became known as the Bandit Queen, and her story was quickly transformed into frontier folklore. Hart's robbery was not a long criminal career, but the sheer audacity of it made her one of the most famous female outlaws in American history. At number 10, Laura Bullion. Laura Bullion was deeply connected to the Wild Bunch, the outlaw organization associated with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Unlike women who were merely romantically connected to criminals, Bullion actively participated in the gang's world. She reportedly helped with robberies and transportation of stolen money. She eventually served time in prison after being convicted for her role in a train robbery. Laura Bullion's story demonstrates that women could play active logistical and criminal roles within outlaw organizations rather than simply standing on the sidelines. At number 9, Etta Place. Etta Place remains one of the most mysterious women of the Old West. She was associated with the Sundance Kid and traveled with members of the Wild Bunch. Unlike some female outlaws, her exact role in criminal activities remains uncertain. Much of her life is hidden behind conflicting accounts and unanswered questions. Even her real identity and eventual fate have generated decades of speculation. That mystery is precisely what makes Etta Place so fascinating. She wasn't necessarily the most violent woman on this list, but she lived directly inside one of the most notorious outlaw circles in frontier history. At number 8, Rose Dunn. Rose Dunn became known as the Rose of Cimarron. She was connected to the Doolin gang and reportedly helped outlaw George Bitter Creek Newcomb escape after he was wounded during a shootout. According to accounts, Rose risked herself to bring him a weapon and ammunition. Her connection to the gang gave her a reputation that was far more dangerous than her appearance suggested. Unlike some women whose stories were based mostly on rumors, Dunn's name appears repeatedly in accounts of the Oklahoma outlaw world. At number 7, Kitty Leroy. Kitty Leroy was a gambler, performer, and gunwoman whose reputation was built around her ability to handle firearms and survive in the rough culture of frontier towns. She reportedly became skilled with weapons at a young age and worked in environments where gambling, drinking, and violence were common. Women like Leroy could not afford to appear helpless. Her story represents a different type of danger, the frontier woman who learned how to protect herself in places where the law was often miles away. At number 6, Kate Bender. Few stories from frontier Kansas are darker than the legend of the Bender family. Kate Bender and her family operated an inn in Kansas in the early 1870s where travelers reportedly disappeared. Authorities eventually connected the family to a series of murders and robberies, although many details remain uncertain because the Benders vanished before they could be properly prosecuted. Kate Bender became one of the most infamous women in Kansas folklore. Whether every story told about the family was true or not, the bloody Benders remain one of the most disturbing chapters of the frontier era. At number 5 is one of the most famous female outlaws in American history, Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley, Starr became associated with notorious criminals, including Jesse James and members of the Younger family. After marrying outlaw Jim Reed, she became increasingly involved with the criminal world. She was accused of helping organize robberies, hiding fugitives, and dealing in stolen property. Starr embraced the outlaw image, sometimes appearing in buckskin clothing while openly displaying firearms. Her life ended violently in 1889 when she was shot from behind while riding near her Oklahoma home. Her killer was never definitively established, which only added to her legend. At number 4, Rose of the Wild Bunch, Laura Bullion. Laura Bullion deserves another look because her involvement with the Wild Bunch was more than romantic association. She became part of the machinery that allowed outlaw operations to function. She traveled with criminals, handled stolen money, and participated in the gang's activities. Eventually, she was arrested and imprisoned. Her story shows just how blurred the line could become between romance, survival, and organized crime in the Old West. Pearl Hart returns at number 3 because her story was so unusual that newspapers couldn't resist turning her into a celebrity. A woman disguising herself as a man and holding up a stagecoach was almost unheard of in the public imagination. Her arrest became a national sensation, and her courtroom appearance became part of the legend. Hart reportedly argued against being judged by laws created without women's participation in government. Her criminal career was brief, but her boldness transformed her into one of the West's most famous female outlaws. Belle Starr takes the number 2 position because few women became so completely identified with the outlaw world. Her connections stretched across some of the most notorious criminal networks of the era. She was accused of harboring fugitives, participating in criminal schemes, and operating around stolen horses and property. More importantly, she cultivated a reputation that made her larger than life. Like many Old West legends, some stories about Starr were undoubtedly exaggerated, But her documented encounters with the law were enough to establish her as a genuine frontier outlaw. And at number 1, we're choosing Belle Starr, not because she was necessarily the most violent woman on this list, but because she represents the complete image of the dangerous woman of the Old West. She was independent, rebellious, connected to criminals, familiar with firearms, repeatedly involved in legal trouble, and surrounded by some of the most famous outlaws of her generation. Her life combined crime, romance, violence, mystery, and folklore in a way few other women could match. But perhaps the most fascinating part is what happened after her death. Belle Starr's story continued growing long after she was gone. Newspapers, dime novels, historians, and Hollywood all helped transform her from a real frontier woman into the legendary bandit queen. And that brings us to the biggest lesson about these 20 women. So, which woman from this list surprised you the most? Was it Belle Starr, Pearl Hart, Cattle Annie, Little Britches, or someone else? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey into the darker side of the Old West, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the frontier has plenty more secrets waiting to be uncovered.